we're going to have a conversation about sex. I know, which is a thing that we all find tricky to talk about, but I promise you that we are in the right hands, because with me is writer and director Eleanor Bishop, who is the... Welcome, come in, we're talking about sex. Who is the co-creator with Karin McCracken of a really brilliant theatre piece made for teenagers. It's called Yes, 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 and it's all about healthier relationships and desire and consent. So would you please start by making Eleanor Bishop very welcome. So Eleanor, here's an interesting thing for me to think about, is that we think about sex all the time. It's in all our movies, it's in the songs, it's in the books, but we find it really difficult to talk about, even to the people that we might be having sex with. Why is it so hard to talk about sex?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It shouldn't be. I think it shouldn't be, but it can be. And I think it's because there's just heaps of, like, shame tied up in it. And, I don't know, like, lots of people growing up in, like, conservative households or kind of some kind of religious overtones. And maybe we have this idea that sex is kind of dirty and shameful, but I'm really interested in having that conversation and opening it up to just think about sex. It's just a normal part of human experience. It's one of the great things about being a human. And, yeah, it's just part of the full spectrum of being alive.
Yeah. So how do we make it more comfortable? How do you launch into those kinds of conversations?
Well, I think, like, talking is a great way. And I think with consent, particularly, sometimes people are like, if you talk about having sex or things like that, maybe it's going to kill the mood. But I think for me, and I think for lots of people, the talking about it and the negotiating can be really kind of sexy.
Yeah.
Because it can be romantic, or it can bring you closer. I always ask people, it's kind of my, like, pop quiz thing that I ask people is, like, do you like to be asked, could I kiss you, or can I kiss you? And lots of people have told me that would be something that they would be, like, really into being asked. So I think things like that, just like asking, and that can be really romantic to me, actually.
Yeah, I think so too. Being asked what you want, having it said out loud is actually a really lovely thing to do, right? Because there is that, no matter how old you are or what environment you're in, there's always that kind of, is she leaning in for a kiss, or is she bending over to tie her shoelace? And you don't know, and you're making guesses all the time, which can be kind of anxiety-inducing.
Yeah, I always think of, like, sex as, like, making a meal, or, like, if playing music with somebody, like, you're doing it together, and if you've never, particularly if you've never done it before, it's kind of like, shall I play this chord? Or, like, do you want to do the drum part? Or, you're kind of figuring it out. But that can really build you closer and more connected, I think. And then hopefully maybe you'll get to the point where you're just, like, in tune and in sync, and there is no need perhaps for talking or communication, but you kind of need that to get going, I think.
Yeah, okay, great. And so once you are having that conversation about, would you like me to kiss you, then we're checking in on consent all the time. I just want to take us back a tiny bit, because I feel like my generation, I'm very old, and I have grandchildren, so I'm very old. And I feel like my generation focused on the mechanics of sex. So our sex education was about, there were a lot of condoms going on, a lot of bananas.
Yep.
And there was a lot of talk about sexually transmitted diseases, STIs, STDs. So we talked about safe sex a lot and how sex worked, like what bit goes where. But there was very little talk about consent. There was almost no talk about pleasure. But let's talk about consent. What aren't we talking about in terms of consent? What are we getting wrong?
Yeah, I think we often talk about consent in terms of what I've just been talking about, like verbal, like would you like those things. But body language is just as important in how we communicate consent to each other. And that's kind of what the show's about, like trying to point and draw attention to body language as a way to give consent or not give consent. So, you know, it sounds so obvious when you talk about it, but something about the heat of the moment, sometimes our minds aren't tuned into it. But, you know, leaning forward or leaning back, or if I'm crossing my arms, I'm not into it, or if I'm, you know, actively kissing back, you know, all of these things are ways of giving consent as well as the verbal things. So I think, that's something that we're not always talking about.
Yeah, and sometimes we need to understand some of those things, that being very still might be withholding consent.
Yeah,
point,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We also have to learn that consent doesn't just happen at the beginning and then we're done.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an ongoing negotiation and process. And, if someone says yes to one thing at one moment, they are absolutely allowed to change their mind. And the responsibility is not on the person who is giving or not giving consent. The responsibility is on everyone to make sure that their partner is giving consent at all times,
Can we talk about different genders? Do they get different messages, do we think? I mean, we've kind of referred to that in a way. So do different genders get different messages about sex and consent?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel like it's changing, but there's such an old idea that is rooted in history that, like, and this is super heterosexual, but like sex is something that men do and something that women allow. Like, that is such an old, terrible idea.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that comes from the fact that, like, till, you know, 100 years ago, like, we're still fighting for women's bodily autonomy, you know?
Yeah.
There's this idea that women aren't these real people who can have agency and control of our bodies. Like, that's still an issue with, you know, reproductive rights and abortion rights in the United States. So it's like, that's a really old idea. So I think that plays into, like, heaps of not great stuff about gender roles that, like, in heterosexual relationships, like, guys are supposed to make the first move. That's something I've heard, like, young people talk heaps about, that young girls maybe don't feel like they have the power or the agency to, like, be the person making the first move. But again, I think that's really changing, and I think, like, it's so wonderful when I speak to, like, non-binary young people and trans young people, like, because they're disrupting traditional gender roles. They disrupt traditional ways of negotiating sex and consent, which is brilliant.
This is what I love about that, is that if you were into the binary, if you were into men do this, women do this, then somebody turns up who is non-binary and they go, well, I can do whatever I want. Yeah. Everybody else gets to go, oh, well, then I will be true to me as well.
Yeah. Very liberating.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Sex and porn are really different. How do we get that message across? Because porn is so accessible now and has been for a while. And so if people are watching porn, they're getting a very unnatural view of what sex is. What do we do about that?
Well, it's really interesting, Michèle, because we spoke to a whole bunch of young people all over the country for this show, and mostly speaking to, like, 16, 17-year-olds. And they really knew that porn wasn't, like, natural and naturalistic or accurate, like, to kind of the sexual experience they were having and would be having. So they were very kind of tuned in about that. But, like, the Census Office in New Zealand has done a really interesting study about the age that people are encountering porn. And it is quite young, 12 and younger sometimes. So I think by the time teenagers are, like, 16, 17, 18, they're clued in. Their media literacy is, like, so good. But I think it's earlier, trying to start those conversations earlier, so when people are encountering it, they're not straight away absorbing those messages and then kind of having to undo them. And yeah, the Census Office has a really good guide for parents to talk about pornography with their children, which is obviously like a super tricky, uncomfortable thing to do, but really important. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about the work that you're doing. I want to talk about the show, Yes, 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 which is amazing. I've seen it on video, but you take it as live performances into secondary schools.
Yeah.
Where did the idea come from for the show?
Well, Karin and I had been doing quite a lot of work about like sexual violence, and there was a huge kind of demand for us to do that work in schools. But in terms of consent education, the research and what is shown is that the best practice for talking to young people is to lead with like a strengths-based approach. So like positive, you have the skills, versus like a fear-based approach, like which is kind of probably what I got and maybe you got as well, which is like, it's not that useful because we're already a bit afraid, about sex and the consequences. But the thing is that young people have the skills already to be having great, healthy sexual relationships. It's just deploying those skills in a sexual context. So that was the kind of kaupapa of us going, let's make a theatre piece specifically for young people, which, adults can enjoy too. But let's really go and work with young people and go into schools and hear what they have to say. And I guess for me, like from my heart, it's really about what I wish I had seen when I was 16. Like, so in the show, you hear from young people, but you also hear from Karin, who's a young woman, who's telling a story about, as an adult, as like a 25-year-old, going out and meeting someone at a party and ending up sleeping with them that night, and how they navigate that. And I just thought, man, that's kind of what I wanted when I was 16, like that kind of older sister, like an actual adult telling you, honestly, frankly, how it might work, when you're a bit older. Because I definitely just didn't want that thing where, you've got an adult pretending to be and acting as a teenager. Yeah. Because it's just like there's so much kind of coyness, there's so much euphemisms. It's just like, let's just be honest about this stuff.
Yeah. And it's, there's a lot of joyfulness in the show, as well as some more complicated, darker stuff as well. Yeah, totally.
Because the experience that Karin's talking about, it's like,
it's pretty great.
Yeah, it's great, but it's also like, wow, like hooking up with people is, we're all awkward humans just trying to like live our lives, and there's just so many funny things that happen, and he goes to kiss her and she pulls away, like, and
he
like,
misreads what that is.
Yeah. Then he's like, okay, how do I, it's,
I think it's such a revelation when you're young to work out that actually nobody knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's a really useful message that you get from the show, is that we're all kind of stumbling through it. And that's why asking questions as you go is a really helpful thing to do. What did you learn from the young people while you were creating the show?
Yeah, I mean, so much. I definitely learned a lot about, the kind of online space, which is something that I didn't really have when I was a teenager. I mean, we had like MSN Messenger, so we just like do these crazy like chats, but there was I didn't have a cell phone like for a long, we didn't text each other. So the online space, which I think people get kind of like freaked out about, like adults get kind of freaked out about that as if it's like this crazy big new terrain, but it's the same principles of like, you can negotiate consent in that space in the same way.
Yeah.
And just how smart and switched on young people are today about these things. And I was really moved by, in terms of different high schools in New Zealand, there's heaps of activism in this space.
Yeah.
And heaps of activism from some of the like boys-only schools as well, like to kind of change the culture around sexual violence. Yeah,
I'm finding that really heartening, because I think again I have make a clearly an incorrect assumption that it's young women and non-binary people who are leading in this space. But if the work is being done in boys' schools as well, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, Michèle, I passionately believe that we can end sexual violence in our lifetime because it's an epidemic that affects so many people. But we can end it, but we will only end it with a community effort.
Yeah.
Like, everyone has to come together and play their part. And, like, women have their role to play. Everyone has their role to play, but I think particularly young men have a huge role to play in role modelling and leading by example and challenging each other, which they can do. They can just do that in a different way than, like, I could, you know, because it's just a different relationship.
Yeah. Fantastic. I love that idea that we can end sexual violence in our lifetime. It's a social construct, right? So we can deconstruct it. We can stop doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How do we, in the meantime, support each other when things go wrong? If a friend comes to you, for example, and says, I had a bad experience, a bad sexual experience, what are the good things to say?
Yeah. So if someone comes to you and discloses that they've experienced some kind of sexual harm, there's 3 things that you can say. The first is, it's not your fault. The second is, I believe you. And then the third thing is, are you safe now? Because they might still be in a home environment or a situation where something is going on, so they may need some support. But yeah, it's not your fault. I believe you. Are you safe? And it's really hard when people share these experiences because the stuff is really difficult to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Like, it touches, like, the kind of darker parts of our humanity. But it is really important to talk about it because otherwise we're not going to change it. And if someone discloses something to you, like, it's you might feel like a kind of big responsibility and, like, maybe your head's clouding, but, like, you have a really... That person clearly trusts you, and then you have a really cool opportunity to help that person.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, fantastic. What about pleasure, desire? I mean, that's the bit that was missing from my, sex education as a secondary school student.
Yeah.
So, but how do we do that in a school environment? Do we do that in a...
Well, it was really important to Karin and I to talk about desire and pleasure in the show because that was totally missing from my sex education and totally missing from just a broad conversation, even about consent. It's like, okay, what is consent? Yeah, we want everyone to have safe experiences, right? But more than that, we want everyone to have good experiences. And what is the reason why we're even talking about consent? Because we have desire to have contact with or sex with someone else. So we can't talk about consent without talking about desire. And it's just removing it from, again, what we talked about at the start, this idea that, some dirty thing or shame thing. It's just normal. Like, sexual desire is normal and healthy.
Tell me about the show. So you've been touring it around New Zealand schools.
Yeah.
What is its future looking like?
We're going to Australia in, like, a month.
Amazing.
Yeah, which I'm really excited about. And then, the show is being translated and being performed in some different countries. It's being translated into Welsh and will be performed at the National Theatre of Wales, which is super cool.
I think hearing sex talked about it in Welsh would be delightful.
Yeah. And then a Spanish company as well, so Spanish as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Huge round of applause, please, for Eleanor Bishop.